people superior at?
What exactly are white people superior at?
They're real good at violence.
Violence. Genocide.
It's like stealing people's lives just because they feel like it.
If you are white and you know this is happening and you say nothing, then you're a killer too.
Superior at being dicks.
What exactly are white people superior at?
Oppression.
Gaslighting.
Lack of empathy.
Intellectualizing oppression. Did I say oppression?
What exactly are white people superior at?
Taking what's not there. Taking shit.
Taking our ideas.
Copycatting.
Gentrification.
Appropriating things that do not belong to them.
Taking over other people's cultures and making you believe that they invented it.
Maybe they're thinking of it as repurposing. It's like recycle and repurpose.
As my grandma would say, them white folk, they'll take it if you don't copyright it.
They are very good at destruction of land, destruction of people, destruction of humanness.
I just have to say, the one at the beginning looks brain dead. I'm gonna be like Leafy here and go out on a limb and say that she's not completely human, but just genetically modified with a hippo. Kinda shows the quality of the video. But to get to the point, I'm making a video that I haven't done in a while. It's time for a history lesson. I've always wondered if any woke nitwits would ever say that white people are more violent than other races. It's been in multiple comments, but there was that one tranny from a few years ago.
The uncomfortable truth is that the white race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth.
But we have finally come across it. I think that these people were told to say this for the video, as they more or less say the exact same thing. But there are definitely people who believe this, as a friend from junior high shared one of the blights of social media. So I hope those kinds of people see this video so they can learn some irrefutable facts. Was Europe ever colonized by outside forces?
The word is yes! 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 Say it 1,000,000 times! Say it 1,000,000 more times! And the word you will have said 2,000,000 times is...
Europe has been invaded by African and Asian kingdoms for over 2 millennia, and they even took over some regions. Now let's delve through history to see the largest events that saw European peoples fall to outside forces, all of which did indeed change Europe. The Persian Empire was one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. Starting in 550 BC by Cyrus the Great, it overtook a large part of the Middle East and Central Asia. By the time the empire spanned from India to Turkey, it was divided into satraps, or provinces as you want to call them. All of these were subjugated to a central authority. Their ambitions didn't stop there as they moved further west. The first stop was to conquer the Greek island of Naxos, but in doing so, many people under Persian rule in Asia Minor, which is in modern-day Turkey, revolted. These revolts were supported by the Greek kingdoms of Athens and Eretria, leading to much civil unrest, including the burning of the regional capital, which was called Sardis. But the rebellion failed after the Battle of Lade in 494 BC. But this was just the beginning. In 492, Darius the Great of Persia commenced the first invasion of Greece. The Persians then overtook Thrace, Macedon, and later Eretria, successfully incorporating these regions into the Persian Empire, which were a part of Europe, by the way. In 490 BC, Darius went on the move again, aiming his sights on Athens. But this campaign was ill-fated, and the Persians were defeated at the Battle of Marathon. This defeat halted Persian plans for further movement, and Darius paused to replan for another attack. He died in 486 BC, and so his son Xerxes continued on his plan. In 480 BC, the Persians invaded Greece again, this time with 400,000 troops, one of the largest military buildups in the ancient world. The victory over the allied Greek states at the Battle of Thermopylae allowed the Persians to burn Athens and push further into Greece. The mistake they made was taking on the superior Greek navy in the Aegean Sea. Persians were heavily defeated at the Battle of Salamis, and so they lost their supply lines. That is when the Greeks went on the offensive, defeating the Persian armies one by one, ending the invasion of Greeks at the Battle of Plateau. They continued to keep up the pressure and effectively pushed the Persians out of Europe at the Battle of Mykel in 479 BC. Fighting continued in Asia Minor, which continued to see these regions fall away from the Persian hands. The war ended in 451 BC when the Peace of Calais was signed by the two sides. I can tell that social justice warriors hated every explanation of this event, considering that they disliked the movie 300. Carthage is the capital city of Tunisia, but it was also a very historic place. It was settled in 814 BC by the Phoenicians and later spread across the Mediterranean region. By 300 BC they had pushed further and even taken over several European regions such as the Iberian Peninsula, Balearic Islands, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Malta. Not only that, but they intended to get more out of Europe by invading the Roman Empire in the Second Punic Wars. Hannibal's armies, for example, went on to cross the mountains to reach Rome. Although they did succeed, they lost their siege equipment there and the invasion of the Roman city failed. The only difference was that they lost in that conflict, and it led to the destruction of Carthage itself in 146 BC during the Third Punic Wars. That is when all remnants of Carthaginian civilization came to be ruled by the Romans. They even rebuilt the city under Roman jurisdiction. Now we get to a new part in the video. There's no shortage of tropes that discuss the European colonization of Africa, and yet they push on the narrative that the opposite wasn't true.
Why didn't Africa colonize Europe? That's a very good question that I've just decided to ask myself, and also borrowed from this book by Yanis Varoufakis. Why were the colonizers from Europe so technologically advanced, whilst the indigenous people from Africa had to defend themselves with shields and spears? I think this is a very important question, because the answer to it, and the way we arrive at that answer, forces us to ask a much bigger question about human nature in general. It forces us to ask the bigger question, why do people do the things that they do?
Well, we've already seen how Carthage took over parts of Europe, so strap in because there is a lot more. The rise of Islam started a new empire on the world stage, and its first caliphate spread across the Middle East and North Africa. By the early 7th century, they had begun their conquest northwards, and the second caliphate, known as the Umayyad Caliphate, began its expansion into the Iberian Peninsula. Now I just know that there will be keyboard warriors typing away at how North Africa is inhabited by Arabs and not black people, which only reaffirms their ignorance. North Africa is very diverse. Moors, Berbers, Behas, Sudanese Arabs, Furs, Haratins, Nubians. These are all people that are native to North Africa and are black. Many of these people crossed the Mediterranean to invade Europe along with the Arabs. The easiest point is through the Strait of Gibraltar. The Umayyad Caliphate invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 710 AD, and the Caliph Al-Walid I under the Caliph Al-Walid I. In 711 AD, he managed to defeat the Visigoth king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. After that, they were reinforced by an Arab force led by Musa ibn Nusyar, and then continued northward. In 713 AD, they defeated Theodemir of Murcia, and the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus was set up. By 719, Barcelona and Narbonne had fallen, allowing the most populous cities at the time to fall, and so much of the Iberian Peninsula would fall to the Umayyads. By 781, the area was united under a single government for the first time since the Roman Empire. Only pockets of Visigoth kingdoms remain in the mountainous regions. Some areas of the Iberian Peninsula were ruled indirectly through European proxies, while many regions were directly ruled by the caliphs. The new leader, Abd al-Aziz, sent messages across the area denouncing non-Muslims, calling them nothing but dirt and partisans of Satan. In areas that were indirectly ruled, people had to pay additional taxes because they were not Muslim. And in areas of direct control, a process known as Arabization continued. Arabic became the official state language, the financial administration of the empire was reorganized, and many people that refused to pay the jizya tax were forcefully converted to Islam. Christians and Jews suffered religious discrimination, persecution, and martyrdom at the hand of the Umayyad caliphs. They were also banned from preaching or evangelizing their faith on pain of death. Other misfortunes also involved prohibiting them from bearing arms, undertaking certain professions, and were obligated to dress differently in order to distinguish themselves from the Muslim population. As a result of their additional tax, many Christians and Jewish community were driven to poverty, and when they were unable to pay that amount, they were forced to surrender their children to the Umayyad rulers who would sell them as slaves to Muslim nobles where they would be forced to convert to Islam. While Christians and Jews at least had a chance of practicing their faith, many pagan cultures who lived there did not get that same way. A polytheistic religion was deemed unacceptable by Sharia law, and these people saw a massive attack on their culture for them to be converted to Islam. These events persisted throughout the early medieval period, but the Umayyads couldn't spread their influence throughout the rest of Europe. Crossing into France, or Gaul as it was called at the time, from the Iberian Peninsula would have meant hiking through the Pyrenees Mountains, which meant that any invasion would be slow and costly. That didn't stop them, though, from trying, as they did invade southern Gaul in 719 AD, but they were defeated by the Frankish forces at the Battle of Tours in 732, and all small-scale Muslim attacks were completely finished in 759 when the Umayyads were driven back into the Iberian Peninsula. Kind of an example of the French saving Europe from a Muslim invasion. Anyway, many of the people in the Muslim-controlled Iberian Peninsula only feigned conversion to Islam so that they could use that time to escape north, where they would aid in the resistance against the Muslims. The Umayyad power over the area weakened over time as they frequently lost wars against the Byzantines and where they were plagued by internal rebellions. As early as the later period of the 8th century, European kingdoms rushed into the Iberian Peninsula to reclaim the conquered kingdoms. This was known as the Reconquista, and they pushed further south until they managed to expel all Muslim rulers. This lasted until the 15th century, when the entire peninsula was reclaimed and led to the creation of modern-day Spain and Portugal. But these were not the only African takeovers of European territory. Oh no, we're just getting started. After the Umayyad conquest in North Africa, Carthage, a large port city, was run by them, and it was in close proximity to southern Europe. The first true attack was launched on the now Italian island of Sicily, but it failed. This didn't deter the North Africans, as they invaded again in 752 AD. Attacks were limited at first, but they picked up in 827 AD when there was infighting amongst the Byzantine fleet, and an Islamic force led by Asad ibn al-Furat invaded and took over the south of the island. Despite their losses, the Sicilians put up heavy resistance, pushing back Asad's forces multiple times. It wasn't until 830 AD when the tide turned and the war shifted in the Muslims' favor. They received 30,000 troops from North Africa and managed to capture the Sicilian capital of Palmeo in 831. Under the Islamic rule, they renamed it Al-Madira, or the city. Pockets of resistance continued, but they were then suppressed in 902 AD, and the last Byzantine outpost was conquered in 965. The Emirati of Sicily was born. It was ruled by the Sunni Muslim Aghlabid dynasty from Tunisia and the Shiite Fatimids of Egypt, though much of the population was converted to Sunni Islam. Life for the native population was very similar to that of Muslim-held Spain. Not only that, but Sicily's fertile soil allowed the Arabs to use the land to grow food for the kingdom. Oranges, lemons, pistachios, and sugarcane was all introduced to Sicily, but this was all under the control of Arab rulers and made specifically for them. But the Emirate didn't last, as at the turn of the 11th century, Byzantine troops and Norman mercenaries under Roger I of Sicily sailed to the island to reclaim it. They won battle after battle, and despite the Zirid dynasty sending an army from North Africa, the Normans and the Byzantines defeated all major centers on the island. With the main port cities gone, the Muslim rulers on the island were cut off, and only pockets of resistance remained. In 1087 AD, the last Muslim rulers surrendered and converted to Christianity, while Butera and Note, the southernmost tips of the island, under Arab control, fell to the European forces with ease in 1091. Thus ended the Emirate of Sicily. Much like Sicily, Sardinia was subject to many attacks by North Africa. In 1015, Emir Mujahidid al-Amri invaded Sardinia and even managed to conquer some coastal plains. Inside these occupied coasts, resistance against him was strong but broke down quickly. The Arabs did project influence there, and because of them, a lot of Arabian culture remains in Sardinia to this day. But, unlike Sicily, an alliance of Italian states pushed back the Saracen invader. Southern Italy has been invaded numerous times throughout the centuries, and the majority of Muslims living in Italy lived there. There were even instances of North African kingdom conquering parts of the Italian mainland. Bari is a municipality on the Adriatic coast of southern Italy, and in 847 AD, it was conquered by Black Berbers. The last and most powerful ruler was Saudan between 857 and 871. Several accounts described him as a figure that ruled wisely, but others, mostly non-Muslim accounts, described him as wicked and impossible. Nevertheless, he saw the downfall of the emirate in 871 when a combined force of Frankish and Latin armies retook the city. His kingdom was short-lived, only 24 years, but it is an example of black people colonizing a piece of Europe. And it's not the only one. Taranto is another city in southern Italy, and it was invaded by Muslim warriors in 840 AD. By 846 it was fully established and would function on its own. It was less of an Islamic kingdom and more of a foothold which to start raids in the Adriatic Sea and the surrounding towns. It was home to Arabs, Berbers, and Andalusian corsairs, but the area was constantly plagued by war as Byzantine and Latin forces constantly strived to reclaim the city. It finally fell in 880 AD, lasting for only 40 years. The Italian mainland wasn't completely free after that, as for decades afterwards, North African and Middle Eastern pirates harassed shipping and coastal areas, leading to many naval battles in the region. Any theoretical idea about what Europe would look like under Africa needs only to look at the historic times when Carthage, the Umayyad Empire, and its emirates spread into the continent. There is no need for speculation. It already happened. The only reason why it didn't spread further is not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. They couldn't spread a massive army across the Pyrenees mountains into France. They did not have the navy powerful enough to mount an amphibious assault on the French coast. And even if they had taken over the Italian mainland, they would still have to cross the Italian Alps in order to go to the rest of Europe. So European colonization did spread to Asia. And that is what we will look at next. Was the opposite ever true? Did any Asian kingdoms colonize Europe? Everyone watching this video is probably aware of the Mongol Empire. It was the most powerful empire in the world at the time, reaching its peak in the 13th and 14th century. While they did conquer much of Asia, they also expanded westwards, simultaneously attacking various European kingdoms within a short period of time. The first one to fall was the Kievan Rus, which was the early version of Russia. Between 1223 and 1241, most of what makes up Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine fell to the Mongols. The Mongol invasion of Lithuania happened in the 13th and 14th century, though there is little documentation to explain this. It is still widely believed that the kingdom of Lithuania fell to become a vassal state of the Mongols. By 1240, with much of Eastern Europe under the Mongol boot, the Khan, which was known as a Mongol emperor, focused his sights on the rest of Europe, but invading them wouldn't be as easy as this time. Sending one army to invade Transylvania would have meant crossing the Carpathian Mountains, while going through eastern Poland would have meant negotiating dense forests, both of which are easily defensible positions. But that would not discourage them, and the Khan sent spies and recon forces to pave the way for an invasion. The first two Mongol invasions of Poland were initiated in order to pillage and loot the area in order to devastate the land and to cause enough chaos. But more armies were sent to Europe for this. The lands of Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, which comprises the lands near the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria, were invaded by the same forces with the same goals. However, the Europeans were much more successful there, as the mountainous regions meant that Mongol cavalry wasn't as effective. At the same time, the Mongols invaded the Kingdom of Hungary for the first time. This army was known as the Golden Horde. Under Batu Khan, his hordes sent two units. One was sent to invade the kingdoms of Moldavia and Wallachia in Transylvania, and the other to Hungary. As this was more of a campaign of plunder rather than conquest, the Mongols employed different tactics. They would base their advance on fewer cavalrymen, making speed the key feature of their invasion. This kept the European defenders uncertain of their strength and movement, Even though European forces were larger than the Mongol Tumans, the Mongols attacked from multiple directions before the European armies could unite to fight them. As a result, the Mongols engaged the European armies in various battles and skirmishes and defeated them in detail. Furthermore, the Mongols mostly invaded plains and villages, avoiding forts and heavily defended castles. For centuries, the Mongol people were a nomadic group, able to herd large groups of cattle across large distances at great speed. This allowed them the expertise to move their cavalry very quickly across Europe. The swiftness of the invasion took many by surprise, and the Mongols destroyed everything in their way. The kingdoms of Transylvania and Hungary suffered much more than Poland or Bohemia. Tens of thousands of people were killed as the Mongols pillaged, looted, and burned entire villages to the ground. They would kill up to half the population and destroy much of the cultural and economic records of that period. In general, between 20 and 40% of the population died. The Mongols even pushed all the way to Croatia, where they did the same. The kingdom was poorly fortified at the time, and areas from Zagreb to Dalmatia were burned and pillaged. Europe saw so much destruction that the then Italian monk Rogerius of Apulia even accounted the genocidal element of the invasion and how the Mongols found pleasure in humiliating local women. By the time the European monarchs were ready, the Golden Horde retreated back to their borders. They had succeeded in their goal of stoking fear and panic in Europe. But not everything went smoothly. The Europeans had learned from their mistakes, as in the first invasions they relied on melee combat, and this ended in catastrophe when the Mongols were able to keep a distance and advance with superior numbers. While light infantry and cavalry were decimated by the Mongols, heavily armored knights on horseback proved very effective at fighting them. In the later years, European kingdoms began to improve their heavy cavalry and built fortifications at the borders of their kingdoms. That way, when the Mongols would come again, they would be forced to lay siege to these heavily fortified castles. Guerrilla warfare and stiff resistance in forested areas also harassed the Mongols, which allowed them to be used. When the Mongols invaded Poland and Hungary again in the 1280s, their armies were heavily defeated and they were repulsed to their borders in Eastern Europe. These regions regained their independence in 1480 when Ivan the Great defeated the Mongols, becoming the first Tsar of Russia and forming the Russian Empire. Now, to be fair, life under the Mongol occupation wasn't as bad as the previous conquests I've mentioned before. The Mongols allowed freedom of culture, they also allowed freedom of religion, and they even allowed freedom of travel. They reopened roads and they created the first passport. They were also great traders, opening trade routes and making them safe. It was said that a person could walk from one end of the road to the other without any fear of being robbed. Also, the Mongols allowed a degree of free speech because the Khan of the empire was also obligated to follow these laws, something that was unheard of at the time because monarchs were considered to be above the law. But all that doesn't deny horde-like behavior, the ones that they committed against Europe. They brought the Black Death to Europe by catapulting dead bodies over the walls of Crimea. It was a disease that wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The Mongols allegedly committed the largest genocide in history with tens of millions of deaths. And I say allegedly because there is still some debate over whether or not genocide should fall under the category of conquests. Though they did treat their occupants better, they still had a lot more in common with this next colonizer. The Ottoman Empire is one of the most powerful Muslim empires in history, and its influence shaped the world as we know it today, from politics to culture. It also contributed a lot to science and literature, but it has gone down as one of the most brutal empires in history. Not only did they conquer parts of the Middle East and Asia, but also Europe. They rose to power in 1299 with Osman I becoming its first sultan. Over the next century, they took over many regions of Anatolia and became a world power after conquering the Byzantine Empire in 1453. With their borders in the Bosphorus Strait, access to Europe was easy. The Ottoman military was huge, and they had a lot of armaments that a European army had, from muskets to cannons, outmatching any Islamic military in the previous centuries. For a time, they were unbeatable on the battlefield, and would project their power in Europe. The Bulgarian Empire fell after the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. The remaining Greek states fell after the Byzantine Empire in 1461. Much of Serbia fell in 1459, and it was divided between the Ottomans, Hungarians, and the Venetian Republic. Croatia and Styria were also raided, and the Ottomans then began to invade the Italian states across the Adriatic Sea. In 1480, the Ottomans successfully captured Otranto from the Italians, but they could only hold on to it for a year before the Italians retook it. Albania had been pacified in 1479, after they had been fighting them for almost a century. They reached the limits of their empire when they were at war with Hungary, but after 176 years they managed to conquer them in 1526. One of the most famous wars were that between the Venetian Republic allied with Spain and the Ottoman Empire. In 1462, the Ottomans pushed into Transylvania. They gained many victories but suffered one of the greatest defeats in their history in 1475. They then looked to the Mediterranean, conquering Rhodes, Malta, and Cyprus between 1522 and 1571. The Ottoman Empire pushed quite far into Europe, fighting with them for centuries. This empire became a rallying call for European kingdoms to unite and defend against the advancing horde. The Turks didn't just wage war on land, though. Through all their might on land, they had one weakness. Their navy was inferior to that of the Europeans, and between the 14th and 19th centuries they allied themselves with Barbary pirates from North Africa. Throughout the Mediterranean, they raided European shipping and coastal parts. Genoese towers were constructed in Italy, an example of defense of these attacks. You can still see them today if you go visit Italy. Such raids were prominent all over the country and their various shipping routes. In the 17th century, their ventures went beyond the Mediterranean, as in 1631, corsairs from the Algiers accompanied the Ottoman forces to the Atlantic, where they raided Baltimore in Ireland, sacking the village and capturing most of the inhabitants. They did the same in 1640 when they raided the town of Peasants in southern England. But do you know what was the furthest they attacked? In the summer of 1627, they raided Iceland. Yes, Iceland, killing people in the nearby coastal villages and capturing up to 400 of them. They were bringing war to every corner of Europe. It got so bad that even the Royal Navy sent ships to Tripoli in 1675, burning and destroying Barbary ships. The resulting battle led to a reduction of attacks, but it still continued. In the 18th century, American ships were even being attacked, which led to the creation of the US Navy, and the First and Second Barbary Wars happened in the region. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the European powers had directed their navies towards the Barbars and Ottomans at sea. When slavery was largely abolished, these two areas had trouble doing business, and by 1824 the Royal Navy under Sir Harry Burrard Neal bombarded the Barbary center at Algiers. These raids were fully stopped when France conquered the state in 1830. On land, the Turks began to experience losses as well. When the Ottomans reached Austria, they spent decades trying to break through Austrian borders and crush the Habsburg monarchy, all of which failed when the Ottomans were repulsed in 1664. By then, they were pushed back to Transylvania, but the peace did not last. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire stagnated, and that is when it began to falter. 1683 also saw the start of the Great Turkish War, where a coalition of various European kingdoms, calling themselves the Christian Coalition, pushed them out of Transylvania and the Balkans, succeeding in 1699. Greece gained its independence in 1832 after a successful revolution, and Serbia gained independence in 1867. By the start of the 20th century, the Ottoman borders were right back where they were 4 centuries ago. The Ottoman Empire was one of the parties into World War I as Sultan Mehmed V declared jihad with the intent of regaining more European land. World War I was a huge loss for the empire, and it collapsed in 1918, leading to the creation of modern-day Turkey in 1922. The Ottoman Empire affected Europe in a way that no other outside nation had. Those effects are still seen today. Coffee was introduced to Europe by the Ottomans, as well as certain furniture, carpets, and pillows. Islam also affected Europe the most through the Ottomans, as countries like Bosnia and Albania have large Muslim communities to this day. But just like the Umayyads and its Emiratis a millennia ago, they continued with their brutality. The Ottomans stole farmlands for their own personal use. They stole art from European cities. A prominent example is the alien marbles from Greek cities. Slavery was also a significant part of Ottoman society and economy, and those people came from Europe. Remember the Barbary raids I mentioned earlier? Well, those people were kidnapped and became slaves. Women were turned into concubines and raped repeatedly, while many other people were forced to do manual hard labor. And just like the Islamic conquests before it, the local people were forced to the same persecution because they were not Muslim. Centuries of brutal subjugation persisted, with many incidents where Christians were massacred, from the martyrs of Otranto in 1480 to Sultan Murad IV believing that his empire's decline was a punishment from Allah because of his lax of enforcement of Sharia law in 1631, to the Greek or Assyrian genocides as recently as a century ago. There have been many killings of European people, and worst of all, to this day, the Turkish government still denies these events. The Armenian genocide denial is just the tip of the iceberg. They claim that their historic empire was glorious, and they feel insulted when it's compared to European colonial powers. If anyone watching this video still tries to deny or downplay these events, then it's quite clear that you are brainwashed, forcing yourself to believe that Europe is just a beacon of evil and misfortune, clearly denying reality. Look, if we as Europeans have to give reparations for the colonialism we did, we will agree to it when these regions give their reparations first. When you look at it, we're all equally violent. And every weapon that has changed the course of warfare was invented by non-white people. The spear was made in Africa, the axe in Africa as well, the sword in Anatolia, the bow and arrow in Central Asia, the gun in China, the bomb also in China. So if you want to claim that white people are more violent, let that piece of history speak to you. So that way, if anyone attempts to call a white person a colonizer, it can be directed right back at them.